Abandoned single mom collapsed at a widower's door. He took them in, and what he did changed. The rain came down in heavy sheets, slapping against the windows and flooding the streets with muddy water. Sarah had walked for hours, her feet aching, her spirit more exhausted than her body. Her once joyful smile had faded long ago, replaced by the deep lines of worry that came with facing a life full of struggles. The small town she had ended up in wasn't much different from the others she had tried to call home. The same feeling of loneliness crept into her every night, and the constant stress about how to provide for her young daughter Ella was becoming too much to bear. Sarah had been a mother for nearly 5 years now, but the responsibility of raising a child on her own had left her feeling more isolated than ever. After the breakup with Ella's father, she had hoped that things would get better, but life had a different plan. Job after job came and went, and the small savings she had set aside was quickly draining. Every time she thought she had found stability, something else would go wrong. She felt like she was barely holding on, running out of hope. That morning had been just like the others. Endless phone calls to try to find a job, searching for food on sale, and doing everything she could to make sure Ella didn't feel the strain. Ella, with her bright eyes and endless questions, didn't quite understand the weight of what was going on, and Sarah was grateful for that. She tried to shield her daughter from the reality of their life, pretending everything was fine, even though Sarah could feel herself unraveling inside. They lived in a modest apartment in a run-down building, but to Ella, it was home. To Sarah, it was a constant reminder of everything she had lost. The night had fallen earlier than usual, and Sarah's mind was racing. She still hadn't found work, and with rent due in a few days, she felt the pressure building up. She tried to stay calm, but the reality of the situation hit her hard. She was alone, struggling, and she didn't know where to turn. The thought of Ella growing up in a broken home, without the stability every child deserved, tore at her heart. She had always promised herself she would be strong for her, that she wouldn't let her daughter feel abandoned. But the longer the struggle went on, the more Sarah felt she was failing. The apartment felt colder as the night dragged on. Ella had long since fallen asleep on the couch, her small form curled up under an old blanket. Sarah smiled softly at her, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. She quietly gathered the dishes from dinner and set them in the sink, her movements slow, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her. That's when it happened. She hadn't planned on it. She hadn't intended to leave the apartment or wander the streets, but in that moment, it felt like the only option. Sarah grabbed her coat and stepped out into the night, the cool air biting at her skin. The rain had let up a bit, but it was still cold enough to make her shiver. She had no destination in mind. She simply walked, letting her feet guide her, hoping that somewhere, somehow, she might find an answer to the endless questions that filled her mind. As she walked, the thoughts raced through her head. She had always been independent, always prided herself on being strong. But now, that strength felt like it was slipping away. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly happy, and every step seemed to take her further from the life she once dreamed of. She didn't know how long she had been walking or how far she had gone, but suddenly she found herself at the edge of town. She had passed the familiar streets, the shops and homes, and now she was standing in front of a house she had never seen before. It was large and old, the lights inside casting a warm glow through the windows. It looked inviting, like a place where people didn't have to worry about the rain, the bills, or the heartache that seemed to follow Sarah wherever she went. Without thinking, she moved closer to the door. Her body was weak, and her head was spinning. She wasn't sure what she was doing. Maybe she was looking for someone to help, or maybe she was simply too tired to keep going. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the wooden door, and then, without warning, her legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed on the porch, too exhausted to get up, too overwhelmed by everything to even try. For a few moments, all she could hear was the pounding of her heart in her ears. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing, but it was impossible. Her body had reached its limit. She was spent. She had nothing left to give. And then, just as she thought she couldn't go on any longer, she felt something shift. A shadow appeared above her, blocking the rain from hitting her face. A man's voice, gentle but firm, called out to her. She opened her eyes, her vision blurred from the tears and exhaustion. The man was looking down at her, his face kind but with a hint of confusion. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft yet filled with concern. Sarah could barely form the words. Her mouth felt dry, and her throat was tight. She could only nod weakly, her body too tired to even speak. The man knelt down beside her, his strong hand supporting her as he helped her sit up. "What happened?" "Are you hurt?" he asked again, his voice now tinged with worry. She shook her head, not sure how to explain. She had no energy left to speak, no strength to explain why she had ended up on his doorstep. She wanted to thank him, to tell him that she was fine, but the words just wouldn't come. She only stared up at him, confused and lost. "Come inside," the man said, standing up and offering her a hand. "You look like you need help." Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to do. She had always been cautious about trusting strangers, but in that moment she realized that she didn't have any other choice. She nodded faintly and allowed him to help her inside, her mind spinning with questions. Once inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around her, and she felt herself finally start to relax. The man led her to a chair near the fireplace, where she sat down, grateful for the heat. He didn't ask any more questions, just went about making her a cup of tea and offering her a blanket. As she sat there, trying to gather her thoughts, she couldn't help but wonder what had brought her here. What was it that had made her collapse at this stranger's door? And what was it that made him take her in without a second thought? In that moment, Sarah realized that her life was about to change, but she couldn't have known just how much. This one small act of kindness, from a man who had no reason to help her, was the beginning of something that would alter the course of her life forever. Sarah sat in the warm glow of the man's home, wrapped in a blanket that seemed to comfort her in ways she hadn't felt in a long time. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of freshly brewed tea filled the air. She felt both grateful and confused, grateful that this stranger had taken her in, offering shelter without hesitation, but confused by the kindness that seemed to come so naturally to him. In all the years she had been on her own, Sarah had learned to be independent and self-reliant, but tonight she had no choice but to accept help. She didn't know where else to go. The man, who had introduced himself as Daniel, sat across from her, his quiet presence offering a sense of peace she hadn't realized she needed. He didn't ask her questions right away, which she appreciated. The last thing she wanted was to relive the details of her struggles. Instead, he simply offered her warmth, a place to rest, and the quiet space she so desperately needed. As she sipped the tea he had made for her, she couldn't help but wonder about Daniel. He seemed kind, but there was a sadness in his eyes, a quiet sorrow that matched her own in some way. She had noticed the photos on the walls when she walked in, a couple of older pictures, one of a woman smiling beside Daniel, and another of a small family, with a child in the middle. He hadn't said much about himself, but Sarah could sense that there was more to him than met the eye. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was thick with unspoken words. Sarah tried to gather her thoughts, but the exhaustion from the day and the emotional toll it had taken on her was overwhelming. She leaned back in the chair, allowing herself to close her eyes for a moment, grateful for the peace that surrounded her. Daniel, noticing her fatigue, stood up quietly and moved toward a nearby bookshelf. Without saying a word, he pulled out a thick blanket and spread it over the couch. "You can sleep here for the night." "I'll get you some extra pillows," he said softly, his voice warm but not intrusive. He moved about the room with a calm efficiency, as though he had done this for others before, though Sarah wondered if that was even possible. His home felt lived in but not overly crowded, just a quiet, simple place. "Thank you," Sarah managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. She had always been proud, never one to ask for help, but tonight the words came easily. She had no choice. There was no pride left in her, just exhaustion. "You're welcome," Daniel replied, his voice steady. He seemed to understand the weight of her unspoken feelings, even if she hadn't said much. His calm demeanor made her feel less like a burden and more like someone in need of a temporary safe haven. As she settled into the couch, Sarah couldn't help but think about her daughter, Ella. She was still asleep back at the apartment, probably curled up under her blanket, unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. Sarah had never been good at asking for help, and the thought of burdening someone else with her problems filled her with guilt. But tonight was different. She had nowhere else to go. The only thing that mattered now was Ella's safety and finding a way to make it through the night. Daniel reappeared a few moments later, carrying a soft pillow and a small lamp that cast a gentle glow in the room. "You'll be more comfortable here," he said, setting the pillow beside her. He made sure everything was in place before standing back. "If you need anything, I'll be in the other room." Sarah nodded, grateful for his kindness. As he left the room, she sank into the softness of the couch, the weight of the day finally catching up with her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring or how she would be able to repay Daniel for his generosity, but for now she allowed herself to rest. She allowed herself the luxury of sleep. The night passed quietly, and when Sarah awoke, the sunlight streaming through the curtains was a soft welcome. She sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the previous day's events on her shoulders, but there was something different in the air now, a sense of calm, a feeling that for the first time in a long time, things might be okay. Daniel was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He didn't seem surprised to see her awake, though Sarah felt a little embarrassed for not waking up earlier. She had no idea what time it was, but the house felt like it had always been this way, peaceful and warm. There was no rush, no hurry. It was a stark contrast to the frantic pace she had been living at for so long. "Good morning," Daniel said with a nod, his voice as calm as always. "I made some breakfast if you're hungry." The exhaustion still evident in her eyes. She didn't want to admit it, but she was starving. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't mean to sleep so late." "No need to apologize," Daniel replied. "Rest is important. We all need it." Sarah sat at the table, her body still aching from the stress of the previous weeks. The meal was simple: scrambled eggs, toast, and a few slices of fruit. But it was the kind of meal that made her feel at home. For a moment she allowed herself to enjoy it, to savor the quiet peace that had settled around her. She wasn't sure how long it would last, but in that moment it was enough. As she ate, Daniel sat across from her, sipping his coffee in silence. She didn't feel the need to make conversation, though the quiet felt different than the loneliness she had felt in her apartment. This silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. She realized that she didn't have to fill the air with words to feel understood. Daniel had a way of making her feel seen without needing to ask 100 questions. His silence spoke volumes, just as hers did. After breakfast, Daniel excused himself for a moment, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She didn't want to stay, but she also didn't know where to go. She felt guilty for taking up his time, for burdening him with her troubles. But as the day passed slowly, Sarah began to realize that maybe, just maybe, Daniel wasn't seeing her as a burden at all. Maybe he saw something in her that she had forgotten about herself: strength, resilience, and the ability to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. When Daniel returned, he didn't pressure her to leave or to stay. He simply asked if she was ready to talk. Sarah nodded, and they sat down at the table together. For the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to speak about the weight she had been carrying. She told him about Ella, about the struggle to keep going, and the fear that had been with her every day. Daniel listened, his calm presence never wavering, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt heard. As the conversation continued, Daniel shared a little about his own life. He spoke quietly about his late wife, how they had built a life together, and the emptiness he had felt since she passed. He didn't go into great detail, but Sarah could sense the sorrow he still carried. It was clear that both of them had been living with grief, each in their own way, but in the presence of one another, they began to understand that healing could come in unexpected forms. The morning turned into afternoon, and the two of them continued to talk, the connection between them growing stronger with each word. There were no grand gestures, no promises of forever, but there was an unspoken understanding, a shared sense of resilience. For now, that was enough. Days passed, and the quiet life Sarah had been living at Daniel's house began to feel like a strange kind of dream. It was as if she had entered a different world, one that was so different from the chaotic, tiring life she had left behind. Each morning she woke to the sound of birds singing outside the window, and each evening she would sit by the fire feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of worry didn't seem so heavy here. Daniel's presence brought a kind of calm that Sarah had forgotten was possible. She started to feel like herself again. Slowly, at first, she found herself smiling more often, her laughter filling the house as she spent time with Ella. The little girl, once withdrawn and quiet, began to open up too. She would run around the house with a small, bright grin on her face, finding new corners of the home to explore. Sarah could see the change in her daughter, the way she started to feel safer, the way her eyes sparkled again. Ella had always been the light of Sarah's life, but now, in this new space, she was shining brighter than ever. Daniel, too, had become a fixture in their daily lives. He never pushed for anything from Sarah, never demanded answers or explanations. Instead, he offered what he could in the most natural way possible. If Sarah needed a moment of quiet, he respected that. If Ella wanted to play or ask him questions, he answered them with kindness and patience. There was no pressure, no expectations. It was a gentle, slow process, but Sarah was starting to feel a shift inside herself. A change that she hadn't expected. One evening, after dinner, Sarah found herself sitting at the table with Daniel. Ella had already gone to bed, her small form tucked into the covers in the room she shared with her mom. The fire was low now, and the house had settled into a peaceful silence, save for the occasional crackle of the embers. Daniel sat across from Sarah, his gaze soft, as though he was considering something he wasn't sure how to say. He didn't rush the moment, he simply waited. Sarah, feeling the weight of the silence, looked at him and noticed something in his eyes. A question he hadn't asked yet, but one that hung between them. "I've been thinking," Daniel said finally, his voice quiet, "about what happens next." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean? She wasn't sure, but she could sense that he was talking about something more than just the moment. He was talking about what came after this strange, unexpected chapter of their lives. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted softly, her voice low as she glanced down at her hands, fidgeting nervously with the edge of her sleeve. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, Daniel. I'm just not sure how to move forward. I don't want to be a burden." Daniel smiled gently, leaning back in his chair. "You're not a burden, Sarah. You've been through so much, but I'm not asking you to figure everything out right away." He paused, giving her a moment to take in his words. "What I want is for you to be okay, for you and Ella to feel safe. And if that means staying here a little longer, then I'm happy to give you that space. No pressure." Sarah looked up at him, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to hear those words. She had been so caught up in the idea of paying back the kindness Daniel had shown her that she hadn't considered that maybe she didn't have to pay anything at all. Maybe, just maybe, this was what it meant to truly care for someone, to offer kindness without expecting anything in return. The days that followed were filled with small moments that made Sarah's heart swell with gratitude. Daniel wasn't just offering a roof over their heads. He was offering a sense of belonging, a feeling of home that Sarah had almost forgotten existed. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to settle into a new rhythm. She helped around the house, cooking meals, cleaning, and finding small ways to contribute. She didn't have a job yet, but the thought of it no longer filled her with dread. She knew that in time she would find a way to support herself and Ella. But for now, she was learning to let go of the constant pressure to do everything alone. She didn't have to struggle every day. She didn't have to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. Daniel had shown her that sometimes it was okay to let someone else carry some of the weight. It was okay to trust. One afternoon, as Sarah and Daniel were sitting together outside, enjoying the warmth of the sun after a light rain, Sarah found herself opening up in a way she hadn't planned. It wasn't a big conversation, just small words, but they felt like a turning point. She told Daniel about her past, about the mistakes she had made, the way she had tried to keep everything together even when she was falling apart. She talked about Ella's father and how the relationship had ended, leaving her to navigate the world as a single mom. She explained how she had always felt like she had to do it all on her own, how she had never felt like she could do it all on her own. Daniel listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and understanding. He didn't judge her. He simply offered a quiet, safe space for her to be herself. And when she finished speaking, there was no pressure, no expectation for anything to change. He simply said, "You've done your best, Sarah. That's all anyone can do." Those words were simple, but they meant everything to Sarah. She had spent so much time feeling like she wasn't enough, like she had failed at everything. But in that moment she realized that doing her best was all anyone could ask for, and that was enough. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to keep moving forward. As the weeks continued to pass, Sarah found herself feeling stronger. She wasn't there yet. She still had her fears, her doubts, but she was beginning to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by the struggle. Daniel had given her the space to find herself again, to heal, and to reconnect with the person she had once been before everything became so difficult. She also began to see a side of Daniel she hadn't fully understood before. He was quiet and reserved, but there was kindness in everything he did. There was a warmth in his actions that spoke volumes, and Sarah realized that his own pain had shaped him into the man he was today, a man who understood the value of compassion because he had known loss himself. There were still many unknowns, still many unanswered questions about what the future held, but for now Sarah was content to simply be present in the moment. For the first time in a long time she felt like she could breathe. And as Sarah stood on the porch one evening looking out at the setting sun, she realized that life, though unpredictable, could still hold moments of peace, and that the most unexpected people could show you what it meant to truly live. The days stretched into weeks, and Sarah started to notice the subtle shifts in her life. The house that had once felt so unfamiliar was now a place she could call home. It wasn't just the four walls or the comfort of the meals Daniel prepared, but the sense of peace that had begun to settle in her heart. There was no longer the constant hum of anxiety that used to accompany every waking moment of her life. She had learned, slowly but surely, to let go of the need to control everything. Life wasn't perfect, but it was becoming something she could manage with Daniel by her side. As for Daniel, his quiet presence had grown familiar in the best way possible. She had come to appreciate his calm, his ability to stay composed even in moments that would have made others panic. He wasn't one for grand gestures or speeches, but his actions spoke volumes. He made sure there was always food on the table, that Ella had everything she needed, and most importantly, he made sure Sarah knew she wasn't alone in this anymore, and that meant more to her than anything. But there was still a nagging feeling in the back of Sarah's mind, a feeling that told her she couldn't stay here forever. She couldn't keep relying on Daniel, even though he never made her feel like a burden. She knew she had to stand on her own 2 feet again. She had to find a way to provide for herself and for Ella. She had promised herself that once she had the chance, she would take control of her life again. But that day hadn't come yet, and as much as she wanted to, Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave. One evening, as the sun began to set, Sarah sat on the porch, her thoughts swirling in her head. The sky was a deep orange, the kind of sunset that made the whole world feel still and quiet. Ella was playing in the yard, running around with a toy in her hand, laughing as the wind tousled her hair. Sarah watched her daughter, a feeling of warmth spreading in her chest. For the first time in a long time, Sarah could honestly say she wasn't worried. Ella was happy, and for Sarah, that was everything. Daniel joined her outside, his footsteps quiet as he walked toward her. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to her, allowing the silence to speak for itself. It was the kind of comfortable silence that didn't feel awkward. It felt natural, as if they had been sitting together for years, simply sharing the moment. "Ella's really been enjoying herself," Sarah said after a few minutes, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the peacefulness of the evening. Daniel nodded. "She's a bright little girl," he said, his voice warm. "She's been through a lot, but you can see the change in her. She's starting to find joy in things again." Sarah smiled, feeling a tear prick at the corner of her eye. I just want her to have the life she deserves. A happy one. I don't know how to make that happen, but I'm trying. You're doing more than trying, Daniel said, his voice steady. You've brought her here. You've given her love, safety, and stability. That's what she needs. His words made Sarah feel something deep in her heart. She had spent so long thinking she wasn't enough, thinking she had failed Ella. But here, with Daniel's quiet support, she was starting to see that maybe she had been enough all along. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do everything on her own. Thank you, she said, turning to look at him. I don't think I've said it enough, but thank you for everything. You've helped more than I can ever explain. Daniel gave a small smile. There's no need to thank me. You don't have to repay kindness. I'm just doing what's right. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't find the words to express the gratitude that filled her. He had done more for her than anyone else ever had, not just in providing a roof over their heads, but in giving her a sense of belonging, something she hadn't known she was missing. It wasn't just about the material things. It was about the feeling of being cared for, of knowing that there was someone who wanted to help, someone who believed in her even when she hadn't believed in herself. But as much as she appreciated Daniel's kindness, she knew deep down that she had to find her own path. She couldn't keep relying on him. It wasn't fair to either of them. She needed to get back on her feet. And for Ella's sake, for her own sake, she had to start building the future she wanted. A future that wasn't defined by fear and uncertainty. I need to start looking for work, Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to Daniel. I need to find a way to contribute, to provide for Ella. I don't want to stay here forever. Daniel looked at her, his expression thoughtful. I understand, he said softly. You've been through a lot, and you've come a long way. It's time for you to stand on your own again, but just remember, you don't have to do it alone. You've got a support system now. Whatever you need, I'm here. His words were exactly what Sarah needed to hear. She had been so focused on the idea of standing alone that she had forgotten that she didn't have to do everything on her own. She had Daniel, and that was something she hadn't realized she could rely on. But more than that, she realized that she didn't have to do this by herself. There were people who cared, people who were willing to help, and that made all the difference. The next few days were filled with small steps toward a new beginning. Sarah began looking for jobs again, her search more focused now, with the determination to create a life for herself and Ella. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face the challenge. And as she filled out applications and sent out her resume, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The future wasn't so unclear anymore. There was a path in front of her, and for the first time she felt like she could walk it. And even though she didn't have all the answers yet, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. And that, in itself, made all the difference. The days continued to pass, and Sarah found herself slowly but steadily adjusting to this new chapter of her life. The uncertainty that had once filled every moment seemed to be slipping away. The weight of fear, worry, and doubt was still there, lingering at the back of her mind. But it no longer controlled her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had the power to shape her own future. And with each small step forward, she grew stronger. It had been a few weeks since she had started her job search, and while she hadn't yet landed the position she was hoping for, Sarah felt a shift in herself. She wasn't as afraid of failure anymore. The fear of rejection still stung, but it didn't have the power to stop her. She had been through too much, survived too many obstacles, to let fear dictate her life any longer. Daniel had continued to be a steady presence in her life, always there when she needed him, never pushing but always supporting. The moments they shared together were simple, quiet conversations over meals, the occasional walk through the woods behind the house, and the shared laughter when Ella would do something funny. Sarah had come to realize that these small moments were everything. They were the moments that made life feel full, even when things weren't perfect. Ella, too, had blossomed in ways Sarah hadn't expected. She was happier now, more confident, more willing to explore the world around her. Sarah could see the change in her daughter's eyes. There was a light there now, one that hadn't been there for a long time. Ella had stopped asking questions about why things had been so hard before. She had stopped wondering why they had to leave their old home. She had stopped worrying. And seeing that, Sarah knew that the choice she had made to bring her daughter here, to this place, had been the right one. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, and that was all that mattered. One evening, as the sky began to darken, Sarah sat on the porch, watching the stars begin to appear, one by one. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. Daniel had already gone inside to finish some work, but Sarah found herself lingering outside, her thoughts drifting as she took in the peaceful quiet of the night. It wasn't that long ago that she had felt like her world was falling apart. She had felt like she was losing everything, like she was just one mistake away from losing her daughter and her home. She had felt like a failure, like she was never going to get things right. But now, here, in this moment, Sarah could feel something different, a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. She wasn't there yet, but she was on her way. She could see a future for herself, and for the first time, she felt like it was within her reach. Daniel came outside, his footsteps soft on the wooden porch as he sat down beside her. They didn't say anything at first, but Sarah could feel his presence beside her, steady and calm. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled with words. Just being there together was enough. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. She didn't need to explain what she was thanking him for. He knew. Daniel turned to her, his expression gentle. "You don't need to thank me."
"I'm just doing what anyone would do. You've been through so much, Sarah."
"I just want you to have the space you need to heal, and to build a life for you and Ella." Sarah smiled softly, feeling a warmth spread in her chest. It was strange, this feeling of gratitude that seemed to fill her every time she was around him. But it wasn't just gratitude for the things he did. It was for the way he made her feel. He made her feel safe, supported, and most importantly, like she wasn't alone. And that was more than she could have ever hoped for.
"I know,"
she said softly. "But still, I can't help but be grateful. You've given us so much."
"You've given me a chance to start over."
Daniel nodded, his gaze turning toward the horizon. "You've done the hard work, Sarah. You've come this far."
"I'm just here to help you along the way."
His words meant more than he could know. Sarah had spent so much time feeling like she wasn't enough, like she had to do everything alone. But here, with Daniel, she realized that it wasn't about doing everything on her own. It was about allowing others to help, allowing herself to accept love and support. It was about finding strength in others, in the small, everyday moments that made life worth living. As the night grew darker and the stars above began to shine brighter, Sarah and Daniel sat in quiet companionship, each lost in their own thoughts. There was no rush, no pressure to talk or fill the silence. They didn't need to explain anything to each other. They simply understood. The next few weeks brought more changes for Sarah. She finally received a call back for a job interview, something she hadn't expected so soon. She felt a rush of excitement, followed quickly by nerves. But she didn't let the fear stop her. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let self-doubt stand in her way now. The interview went well, and though Sarah didn't get the job right away, the fact that she had put herself out there was enough. She knew she was on the right path. It wasn't going to be easy, but she was moving forward, and that was all that mattered. One afternoon, a few days later, Sarah was sitting in the kitchen helping Ella with her homework when Daniel walked in. He had a letter in his hand, his expression unreadable as he handed it to her. "What's this?" Sarah asked, taking the envelope from him. "Open it," Daniel said, his voice quiet but full of anticipation. Sarah tore open the envelope, her heart racing. Inside was a letter from the company she had interviewed with. It was an offer. They wanted her to start as soon as possible. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she read the letter. She had done it. She had taken the leap, and now she was beginning to build the life she had dreamed of. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was hers. And that she realized was enough. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at Daniel. "I couldn't have done this without you." Daniel gave her a small, knowing smile. "You did it all on your own, Sarah. I just helped you find the strength to believe in yourself again." And for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed him. She had come so far. And though there was still much work to be done, she knew that with Ella by her side, and with the quiet support of Daniel, she was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but Sarah knew that she was no longer afraid. She had found a home, a family, and a sense of peace that she hadn't thought possible. And for the first time in years, she could see a future filled with hope.